Okay, well with that, I'm going to bring up Dr. Rick Townsend, and I know a lot of you guys came tonight to hear him talk about the different theories about the Star of Bethlehem. All right?
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to be here. This is a story that I heard for the first time almost 20 years ago. And you probably remember, if you're old enough, there were some ads a while back that said something like, I was so impressed with this product, I bought the company. Well, I was so impressed with this story, I started doing the presentation myself. So some of you have seen the DVD that Professor Rick Larson came out with a number of years ago. I used most of his research with his blessing. In fact, we'll use some of his video, and his wife does music. I'll give you some references at the end. But let's just get into this, and I want to tell you the story of the Star of Bethlehem, and I hope that you'll find it as compelling and cohesive as I find it. This is not the only possible way to look at the Star of Bethlehem, and I want to start out by saying I am not dogmatic. I am not saying this is the only possible way the story could be told, but I think it is a way that has more pieces that come together than any other story that I've seen. So let's dive into one possible way to think about the Star of Bethlehem. The way that I'm going to tell the story involves several disciplines. It will be including history, it will include biblical narrative, and it will include the science of astronomy. So it brings those three disciplines together in a way that I think is a fairly unique way for it to be told. One of the ways that we frequently see the story told is through an image that looks something like this. And this is almost certainly not the way that it happened, because we see the baby and the manger and always three wise men. But in fact, we don't know how many magi there were. We'll get to that in a little bit. But when they came and presented three gifts, it was in a house. And so it was sometime later. So that's one of the clues we'll look at. So my first question to you is, what do you believe about the star? Have you ever thought about it? That may be a rhetorical question. Most of you haven't given a lot of deep thought, so maybe it's more important to ask, what do I believe about it? Because it's all about me tonight, right? What my beliefs are. So I believe it was a real event, or more accurately, a series of events over a period of time. I think it's discoverable. I think there are clues both in the Bible and science. There is no conflict ever between science properly done and the biblical narrative. There can't be. If both of those point to truth, then there will never be a conflict between Bible and science. And I think God expects us to use the gifts that He's given us. He is not the least bit intimidated if we ask questions, because He will always provide the answers, or there will be things that we can't know. And that's okay too. It's some things we have to live with a little bit of tension there. So it's a real simple outline tonight. We're going to look in two places. We're going to look at the biblical clues, and we're going to look at this astronomical search to find where those clues are found in science and line them up with the biblical narrative. We see ideas about stars, constellations throughout Scripture. Here's one in Numbers, for example. A star will come out of Jacob. And so we see these references to God rolling out the heavens like a garment. We see references to constellations, especially in the book of Job, but in other places as well. It's also in Joel, it's also in the New Testament. So we'll look at some of those tonight. And so let's start with the biblical clues. And where we're going to look in the Bible are these areas. We'll look at the Gospels, we'll look at the Revelations to John and to Daniel, we'll look at the Magi, who they were, and then we'll summarize from all those things 9 separate points that are clues to what we're looking for that all come from the Bible. You probably didn't know there were 9 different attributes of the star, but there really are. So we'll line those out. Most of our information is going to come from the book of Matthew. So this passage that you've read so many times because you've charged through the New Testament and you get to Matthew 2 pretty early. So most of you have been through Matthew 2 before you get discouraged at some point. But in Matthew 2, it says, after Jesus was born, that's our first clue, it happens after he's born, in Bethlehem, during the time of Herod, important timing point, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? They didn't know. That's another clue for us, but they knew that there was a specific place. They saw his star in the east, and they came to worship him. That's an unusual thing for a foreign dignitary to do. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed. Note that he was not disturbed until he heard it. That's a clue. What was something that was so incredible that it got the Magi to come from a long distance away, but Herod didn't see it? We'll look for that clue. And when King Herod is disturbed, guess what else happens? All of Jerusalem is disturbed, because he's not a nice guy. So look at all the clues we get just from one passage. All right, so let's look at this phrase a little more closely. This Matthew 2:2. We saw his star in the east. Different versions in English say it translated slightly differently, but I think they tell a really clear story. When it rose, it's a specific time and it rises. It doesn't come down. That's going to eliminate some possibilities. We saw its star when it rose. We observed it as it's rising. We saw his star as it rose. So all of the English translations, and I'm not a Hebrew or Greek scholar, but all of the English translations tell that same story, that it rose and they saw it in the east. Now that could either mean they saw it in the east or they were in the east when they saw it. Since we know they were from the east, it could be a combination of those things. Okay, so let's continue in the passage. When then King Herod called the Magi and secretly found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. So we're looking for something that would have an exact timing point. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go make a careful search, etc. He lies to them, says he wants to worship them. And they go on ahead. The star they had seen in the east went ahead of them during their journey from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, and it stopped over the place where the child was. All of these are clues. Now, there's an important timing question, and that is, when did Herod die? Because this all has to happen during his lifetime. The traditional date of Herod's death is 4 BC. When, in the Middle Ages, when the astronomers were starting to discover things, we had Tycho Brahe and we had Kepler's and his laws of planetary motion. We'll get to him in a second. They immediately started doing calculations to figure out what the star might have been. And they looked before 4 BC and they couldn't find really anything that was compelling. But we find when we look at history, so we're going to bring history into this now, there was an important date that happened in 1450 when the first Bible came off Gutenberg's printing press. You probably know that from your history books. Well, so they started printing Bibles like crazy. In that day, like crazy is slower than today, but still, they were printing Bibles. About 100 years later, they get to the works of Josephus, who was a very important Jewish historian who was working with the Romans, but he wrote, and he was not a Christian, he was a Jewish historian working for the Romans, and he began to write very accurate history, so his stuff is really important. Well, the works of Josephus, about 100 years after the Bible, come along, and all of the older versions of Josephus seem to have this 1 BC date. But there's a transcription error, and after these books are printed, all the printed versions have 4 BC. And so today, that's one of the ideas about why we think Herod died in 4 BC is because some of these histories that are printed after 1544 have that date. But before that, there are more days, more opportunities for a window of time. And when you start looking between 1 and 4 BC, the skies explode with activity. And that's the period we're going to be looking at today. But look at what happens. We have Copernicus before 1544. After this, Tycho Brahe, we have Galileo, Kepler, and Newton all looking at planets. Kepler wrote several books looking for the star, never found it because he's looking in the dates before 4 BC. So fast forward, this was about 20 years ago. It was fairly new information at that point. I did a search recently and came up with, there's even more information now pointing to this likely, or at least the majority position is still 4 BC among scholars, but the minority position is getting more and more traction. And the impact of this, of course, is when Jesus was possibly born is influenced by the date of Herod's death. And so that forms a cornerstone, and it's a really important time period. So we're going to look in this period between 1 and 4 BC. So that's the Gospels. What about John's revelation? Well, John wrote his revelation, and he wrote this incredible passage in Revelation 12. And here's what it says. A great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and with the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head. So these are all astronomical references. She was pregnant, about to give birth, cried out in pain. Another sign appears, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads, 10 horns, all these kinds of things. It's a pretty incredible image. His tail sweeps a third of the stars out of the sky, and he's about to devour the child, a son. So what do we see in this passage? First of all, we see an interesting astronomical reference, a woman clothed with the sun. Now, who would this woman about to give birth be? This is the participatory part. You know who this is? It could be Israel. It could be also Mary. So there's a number, and Scripture frequently has multiple layers of information, all of which could be correct simultaneously. And so we don't know specifically, but it certainly looks like a birth narrative. So if that's true, then who would the son be? Jesus, or the coming of the kingdom of God. And who would be the enormous red dragon? Satan, the great tempter and accuser. So we see all these references, so we're just going to kind of store these away, and as we look in the stars, we'll be looking for what could this actually mean. So let's move on to Daniel. Daniel has a revelation as well, and especially chapter 9, and he says, know and understand this, from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Anointed One, the ruler, comes. And then he gives a list of timing things. He said there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. After the 62 sevens, the Anointed One will be cut off. The end will come like a flood. War will continue, etc. And if we look at these specific dates, the decree to rebuild Jerusalem becomes really important. Now, 62 sevens, we typically interpret those as years. So 62 plus 7 is 69 sevens. So that'll be an important timing point. You'll get your calculators out and we'll figure that out. But then after one more 7, in the middle of that 7, he'll put an end to sacrifice and offering, and on a wing of the temple he'll set up the abomination that causes desolation. This is our period of tribulation that we typically understand. And there's different, I'm not going to get into eschatology, that's not the point of this, but it does give us some important timing points for when the Messiah is to be cut off. So if we look at this and we do the math, 70 sevens is 70 times 7 is 490 years. That's starting when the decree was issued to rebuild Jerusalem. Now we understand that decree to have been given in a specific a specific date, but the Messiah is cut off after 69 sevens, or 490 minus 7 is 483. The decree was issued in 444, so if we add that up, we get an expected date for the Messiah to be cut off in 39 AD. But there's a little bit more to the story. In Jewish understanding, the prophetic year is typically 360 days instead of 365.25 days. And so when you do the math that way, we end up with 476 years. And when we do the math again, this is 31 AD. So if you are a magi and you understand these prophecies, you understand that the Messiah is supposed to be cut off around 30 years from the time that we're looking. If it's around 0 or 1 BC, 180, there's no 0 year, it goes from 1 BC to 180. So you're looking for a Messiah to be born so that he could be cut off some number of years later. Are you with me or did I lose you? Okay. So the time was right for them to be looking for this king to be born. Okay, so if we take all of that together, let's look at the Magi and then we'll summarize the clues to the star. So who were the Magi? There are a number of researchers who've done some work on this, and they say that their tradition is that they were not kings, they were probably high-ranking people in the court of a reigning monarch of some kind. Their tradition is that they were from a highly respected group of astronomers that may have been tied to Daniel and Daniel's captivity in Babylon. If that's the case, the location of Babylon is east of Jerusalem, so they would be east, they would be in the east looking at the stars. It would have built a connection to the Jewish nation if they were part of the heirs of Daniel, because Daniel's, of course, was a well-known member of this court of respected astronomers and people who understood the signs in the heavens. So one of the ideas is that these guys had a specific role that was understood at the time, and that role was that they heralded, announced, and anointed kings. They were king makers. If they were king makers and they came to Herod's reign, do you think that would be disturbing to Herod? So it all starts to make sense, doesn't it? So if they came to anoint a king, then they have to deal with what's happening with Herod. Okay, so let's see what's happening with the 9 clues to the star. So first of all, it has to signify whatever's happening in the astronomy, it has to be some connection that signifies birth. It also has to signify kingship. It has to have a connection with the Jewish nation. Remember, they're coming from a foreign area. It has to rise in the east. It has to appear at a precise time. It has to, Herod would not have known about it. So it's not so obvious he would have seen it if he's not looking. But if you're looking, you couldn't miss it. It endured over some amount of time, was ahead of the Magi from Babylon to Jerusalem, and it stopped over Bethlehem. It was also ahead of them as they went from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. So it was ahead of them twice, actually. So those are the 9 clues. Now, if I can show you 8 of the 9, will you be convinced? You shouldn't be. Spoiler alert, we're going to find some of these. Okay, so if we take these 9 clues and we put them into a chart, it would look something like this. And we're going to say, okay, so can we eliminate some things? So let's look at some of the things that appear in the night sky. So we were just hearing from Parker about meteors, and so could it be a meteor? Let's take a look at that. Well, so if we look at meteors, they are kind of random. They appear more often than others and sometimes the year, but they don't really have a connection with the Jewish nation. They would appear at a precise time, but they couldn't really be predictably ahead of the Magi on the way to Jerusalem. I mean, it's possible that one would, but there's a lot of things that they don't do. They don't signify birth or kingship. They don't rise in the east. They fall in various places. So we can pretty much eliminate a meteor as an explanation for the phenomena that was the star. What about a comet? Now this is interesting. If we look at what a comet does, it does, in fact, appear at a precise time. It endures over some amount of time. The one that's up right now has been there for several months. So it's possible it could have a connection with the Jewish nation. It might rise in the east. It could be ahead of the Magi from Babylon to Jerusalem, but there's a lot of things it doesn't do. It doesn't have anything to do with birth or kingship. Herod would not have known. Herod probably would have known if there was a comet that was obvious at this time. It wouldn't stop over Bethlehem. So we can pretty much eliminate a comet. And additionally, there's pretty good records that we have from the Chinese astronomers in this period. There are no comets recorded. So we can pretty much eliminate a comet. So what about a supernova? Supernovas appear fairly suddenly. They become bright in a period of hours, perhaps, and they will last over weeks or months. So let's look at these. So it could rise in the east. It does appear at a precise time. It endures over some amount of time. It's possible it would have been ahead of the Magi on their travels, but there's, again, a lot of things that they cannot account for. So we can pretty much eliminate a supernova. Well, let's look at planets. What about planets? The first thing we notice when we look at the check marks is all of these are either yes, it does that, it does rise in the east at a precise time, Herod wouldn't have noticed it, wouldn't be that noteworthy, endures over time. The rest are at least possible if we can find some other connection. So a planet becomes our best possible way to look at what are some things that could have happened that would have made it look like there was something for the Magi to do. And so that's where we're going to focus our search. Okay, so the timeline has to be during the time of Herod, likely the period ending in 1 BC. Between 2 and 4 BC becomes the target period because nobody found it earlier. Has to meet all 9 characteristics, and the question is there such a phenomenon? So let's take a look, and we'll go into the astronomy part of the presentation next. So I'm going to give you a little overview in a software program called Starry Night. And this is a Starry Night window, and you'll see at the top up here, you'll see the location. When I recorded this video, it was in Grapevine, Texas, where I live. It was in 2015, and it was November 30th at 4 in the afternoon. Now, anytime we have these windows up with the astronomy, you'll be able to look at where the observation point is and the date. So if I lose you at some point, look up there, or you can wave your arms and we'll point that out. So let me show you what the software is capable of doing, and NASA seems to think this is pretty accurate stuff. So the cool thing about planets is they are very predictable, and as we look at their orbits, we can calculate where they would be at different points in history. So we can go back thousands of years, and again, according to the experts, this is pretty accurate placement of where these astronomical bodies are. So let's look at some of the things we can do. One of the things we can do is we can change direction. This is a background that looks sort of like Lake Grapevine, but it could be any lake, and we can change the background. But we're looking east now. We can also change location. As nice as Grapevine is, it's going to be more important for us to look in Babylon. So I typed in Babylon. We're going to fly to Babylon very quickly because it's software, right? So we just put ourselves there, and it's a little washed out here, but when the light comes back on in the daylight, you'll see that it looks a lot like Grapevine, Texas. So we'll change backgrounds at various points to make that make sense. So as nice as 2015 was, we're actually going to go to 3 BC, and you would notice if the little less light on the screen, the stars are the same because every year they're the same at the same point. So we can adjust the time of day. It was nighttime, now it's daytime. But the day is going to get in our way sometimes, so we'll dim the night sky and hide the daylight so we can look at what's happening, even though at things over time, even though it's maybe daytime. We're going to show the ecliptic, which is a little difficult to see, but it's a green line over in this corner, and that will show up at various points. We'll hide the horizon so we can look below the horizon at what's happening, again, over time without having the Earth get in the way. And then we can look for specific objects. So there's Jupiter. We're going to zoom in on Jupiter. We can zoom in. We can then animate things, and we can change speeds, again, so we can see what's happening over a period of months in a very short amount of time. So as we animate Jupiter, we're going February, March, April, May, etc. And where Jupiter is spinning like a top, and all those little points of light are its moons. So we can do all those things to see patterns, and that's what we're looking for, is patterns over time, because the astronomers who were careful observers would have been looking for patterns and things that are changing over time. So before we get into looking at specific things that happened, I need to explain one more thing, and that is, what about planets stopping? The weird thing is, when we look at the night sky and we just look up there momentarily or for a short period, it looks like everything's stopped, right? So what do we mean by planets stopping? We're talking about what happens over a period of time. And so let me give you an explanation, and it involves retrograde motion. Retrograde means stopping and backing up. So let's look at a typical solar system. Happens to be ours. And so we have the sun, we have the earth, and we'll call this Jupiter. And as we'll put them in motion, one of the things you'll notice is the planets that are closer to the center, they have to rotate faster to overcome gravity. So basically their centrifugal force is balancing gravity. They have to go faster to balance that the closer they are to the gravitational source. So the Jupiter planet, in this case, goes slower. All right, so now we're going to put ourselves on the Earth. We happen to be on Earth. That's very convenient for us, so we don't have to move too far. And our observation line, if we look through Jupiter, and we'll put a dashed line out here, that represents the starry field of the night sky. So imagine this is 3D, and we're going to animate this, and we're going to put it into motion. So as we do that, you'll notice that every time we pass Jupiter, what happens on the outside of this circle is that Jupiter appears against the starry background to stop, back up, and go forward. It stops, backs up, and goes forward as we pass it. It does that every time we pass Jupiter. So that's called retrograde motion, and it's apparent stopping against the background of the starry night sky. Here are some examples of what that looks like, again, over a period of months. So we'll look at 3 planets, Jupiter, Venus, and Mars. So here's Jupiter. So Jupiter is close to that green ecliptic line of the Earth's plane of motion. It stops, it backs up, goes forward again, and goes on its way. And it'll do this about every 13 or 14 months. So it's a fairly common occurrence. But because the planets are in different planes of motion, what happens is that each planet, and sometimes each time we pass that planet, it has a slightly different shape. So here is Venus, for example. It has a different pattern, and it has kind of a loop that's more exaggerated than what Jupiter does. And the green line is just tracing its motion over the period of months. And as we do this, you'll notice that the date up here is going to change by months each time we do the animation. So here's Mars, just one more example. It's going to do kind of a U-turn. So it stops, backs up, goes forward again. And so each planet, and again, sometimes different planets have different retrograde patterns just depending on where we are with respect to that motion. Again, it's because we're all in slightly different planes of motion as we go around the sun. So what I want to do next is show you, this is, example of Jupiter, but it's an important time. So we are in May of 3 BC. The time doesn't matter that much at this point, but we're going to watch what happens to Jupiter. So Jupiter is going to go on its way, and it's going to pass an important star called Regulus once, twice, 3 times. That's not that unusual an occurrence, but it is significant, at least to some extent. So if we center on this constellation, we find that Regulus is in the constellation Leo. So what we have is 3 different objects with a kingly name. So we have Jupiter, which is the king of the gods in the Roman pantheon. We have Leo, which is the king of lions, and it's also called the Lion of Judah. And we have Regulus, the root word of that is regal. And so we get this idea of royalty involved with this, what sometimes is called the coronation of Regulus by Jupiter. Now again, this happens depending on the exact timing of when Jupiter is doing this retrograde motion. This happens fairly often. Certainly once in your lifetime, if you're my age, maybe twice in your lifetime, you will have this occur. But there's some other stuff that doesn't happen very often. So let's look at that. First of all, the astronomers know, remember, they're looking for a king to be born. And here's something they would not have seen. It's a solar eclipse. It's on the opposite side of the world, so they wouldn't have seen it. I think they were good enough astronomers that they knew this eclipse was coming. I don't know if they were good enough astronomers to know that it was not going to be visible from where they were. But it's a full solar eclipse, much like we had in April of last year, but it was on the wrong side of the Earth. But they would have seen it coming, and their attention would be drawn to the night sky. And our date here is August 10th of 3 BC. So keep in mind where we are in the dating system. So their attention is, let's assume for the sake of the story, that they're at least interested in what's happening because of this solar eclipse. And here's what happens next. Jupiter is going toward its first pass with Regulus, and you see Venus coming up and doing a very close pass, and there's our eclipse right there. So that's August 10th. The next thing that happens, the next day, Jupiter and Venus come so close together that they form a single point of light in the night sky. If we look at that from the standpoint of the Magi, this was looking to the east, and Jupiter and Venus appear as a single point of light. And you can see just based on the astronomy software that it's the brightest thing in the night sky. It's probably brighter than anything you've seen in the night sky other than the sun and the moon, unless you've seen one of these conjunctions. And what happens is the light from both of these is so close together that our eyes can't resolve the difference between the planets, but we see the brightness from both of them. And if we zoom in, this is what this conjunction looked like. Again, without the labels. And you'll notice that Venus and Jupiter are both in full phase. So planets, much like the moon, have phases. And they show up the brightest when they are in full phase. So this would have been, again, maximum. Venus is one of the brightest objects because it has a highly reflective gaseous atmosphere. And of course, Jupiter being the largest planet. So both of those are extremely bright compared to other objects in the night sky. So again, it would have been really a bright object. And again, this is called a conjunction. The reason they're rare, again, is because if we look at the orbits of the planets, they're not all in exactly the same plane. They're slightly tilted. So if we look at the solar system, this is the 4 inner planets. You can see Pluto out there, but none of them are in exactly the same plane. So getting them to line up specifically or line up exactly where they form this single point of light is a fairly unusual occurrence. So they saw this conjunction, and again, it was in the eastern sky. But here's what happens next. So Jupiter passes Regulus. We've already had the first conjunction. It passes the third time, and just on the other side of Regulus, to the upper left of this triple pass of Jupiter past Regulus, we see again Jupiter and Venus have another conjunction. Very unusual to have 2 of them in close succession. And if we look at this one, this is what it looks like. And we're now at June 18th, it's actually the night of June 17th of 2 BC is when they would have seen it. If we look at this from the standpoint of the astronomers who were assuming they were in Bethlehem, this is now the western sky, and that's the point of light. So the first one, I think I forgot to point that out, was in the eastern sky. So the first conjunction of Venus and Jupiter was in the eastern sky. The second one was in the western sky. So it's going from the east to the west, almost pointing in that direction. So when we look at these occurrences together, there's a pattern that's really important. Something I didn't emphasize before, but again, this constellation Leo is known as the Lion of Judah. And so we have that going on. But there's something else that the astronomers would not have seen, and you're going to see it now. This is September 11th of 3 BC. It's at the same point as Jupiter is about to pass Regulus for the first time. And this image right here is the morning. It's now 9 a.m., 9:40 on the morning of September 11th of 3 BC. Remember that date. Because what you're seeing is a woman, this is Virgo, the Virgin, clothed with the sun, with the moon at her feet. The Magi would not have seen this. They wouldn't have known to look. But John's revelation, some 70, 80 years later, he wrote about this, probably not knowing what it was. But I believe this is the woman clothed with the sun with the moon at her feet, fulfilling part of that prophecy in Revelation. So John didn't know what he was writing, but we get to see it today because we have astronomy software. I'm going to darken the image so you can see it better. So we're just darkening the night sky, and you'll see that this is a new moon. It's just a sliver of the moon. And if we look at that a little closer, it's a new moon because we just have the sliver right up there, and the moon is at her feet. So just an incredible coincidence or perhaps prophecy fulfilled. So as we look at what happened, we have this triple pass of Jupiter past Regulus, and the conjunctions are either side. So there's the triple pass of Jupiter, as we say, coronating Regulus. Down there, almost exactly, well, very close to 6 degrees to the right and bottom of that triple pass is this first conjunction. The second one is right there. It's an almost perfect symmetry of these events, forming a pattern in the sky that if you're an astronomer looking for patterns, seems like it might be enough to get their attention. I think what happened is the solar eclipse may have gotten their attention. The first eclipse got them really interested, the first conjunction got them really interested, and then we have this triple conjunction or triple pass of Jupiter past Regulus, and then the second conjunction, now they're excited. Now they think this is it. And there's a reason why they thought that. There's a little bit more to the story. But before we get to the more to the story, let's look at this. So the distance between these two in time from September 11th, 3 BC to June 17th of 2 BC, how long was that? Let me do the math. It was 40 weeks. Does anyone know the significance of 40 weeks? Anybody? What's that? It's the gestation period for humans. So if the first time the Jupiter passes Regulus and the woman clothed with the sun happens is conception, that's when Gabriel would have visited Mary. The second conjunction, exactly 40 weeks later, would have been the time that Jesus was born in June of 2 BC. So we have a potential date for the conception and the birth of Christ. Again, it's not the only way to look at this, but I think it's an interesting interpretation. So let's go back to the Magi. The Magi are now officially excited, okay? And they want to go on a journey. Now the distance, as the crow flies, is 600 miles. But the crows weren't flying because there was a crow controller strike or maybe a government shutdown, I don't know. But they needed to prepare because this is a big deal. They're going to go visit a foreign king being born. They're going to present gifts. They're going to need some protection because they're valuable gifts. They're going to need some provisions for a long journey. This is one picture of what it might have looked like. But they're going to need some propulsion, and their propulsion is going to be not crows flying, but they're going to look something like camels. And the camels don't go super fast. So if you have 600 miles, and let's say you can do 20 miles a day, that's going to be a minimum of a 30-day journey. So we said the second conjunction was in June of 2 BC. So let's say it takes several months to get their trip together. They've got to get their gifts and their logistics figured out. So June, let's say August, September, October, maybe by late November they're getting started and they've got a 30-day trek. So let's see what's happening in the sky in late November, early December. And if we look at that period, this is what's happening. So we're now at December of 2 BC, and we're at 5:52 a.m. So this is early in the morning. And if we look at what's happening with Jupiter, it's very high in the sky, and it's moving toward the western horizon. So as we bring the horizon down and Jupiter up, so the sunrise, we're at 5:52, so we're right at sunrise. Now if you're a magi with camels and going on a long journey, you're going to get started early every day because even in December, it's warmer in the afternoon, so you're going to get a start as soon as daylight hits. And so Jupiter every day, as they do this 30-day trek, is tracking toward the western horizon. So as they get up in the morning, Jupiter is overhead. Assuming in the story the way I'm telling it is correct, they're now calling Jupiter the King's Star, and the King's Star is projecting across the sky toward the western horizon every day, setting at about noon. So it is ahead of them as they're going toward Jerusalem. Let's assume then that they're following Jupiter, and as they go on their trip, when is the next time that it's going to stop in the night sky? Let's take a look at the next retrograde opportunity. So Jupiter progresses a few months, almost a year and a half later, and it's from the first conjunction. We're going to look at where it stops in the night sky. We're going to center on Jupiter, and we're going to look at where this next retrograde stopping point is, because it's supposed to stop over Bethlehem. Maybe it's the retrograde stopping point. So we'll kind of anchor on a nearby star, let Jupiter get to the end of that retrograde path, and we'll see where we are. Okay, so right about there. Look at the date. Now we're frequently told that Christmas, as we celebrate it, is some Christianized pagan festival. Maybe it was the time that the Magi actually visited. The star had stopped in the night sky in its progression along the way, and it was around December of 2 BC. If that's the case, then what would happen is that they would be presenting gifts at the time that we call Christmas. Maybe that's why we present gifts at Christmas. But let's go on with our story. So the Magi get to Jerusalem, and they need an audience with the king. Why would they go to Herod? Well, first of all, they are kingmakers, and they can't just traipse into somebody else's kingly reign and not say anything. So they represent a foreign sovereign. Herod would have been threatened. They would have had to coordinate, much as we would today. So why didn't they know? Why'd they have to ask where Jesus was born? Well, perhaps they had access to Daniel's prophecies, but maybe they didn't have access to all of the prophets. And so they didn't know that Micah had said he would be born in Bethlehem. But the Jewish scribes and Pharisees, they did know that. And so they had the answers ready to supply the need. Micah says, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, although you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times." So that prophecy was in Micah. All right, so let's look at what this looks like from the ground. Now you'll notice that we've gone from Babylon to now we're in Jerusalem. So we've changed our location. Here's Jupiter. It's high in the sky, and if we look at where it is and we kind of project down to the horizon, that's south to southwest, and it's a little hard to see, but we're south to southwest. So if you're looking at Jupiter from Bethlehem on the morning of December 25th of 2 BC, it's south to southwest. And if we look at what it's doing, let's look at where it would be about sunrise. Again, we said they're going to be going about sunrise. So sunrise is 6:41 a.m. And we'll kind of let the animation play until the point where the skies start to lighten a little bit, because they'd be going at first light perhaps. And again, that's where we see Jupiter right over the south to southwest point. From our vantage point, as they would have been perhaps starting their journey. If we look at a map, Jerusalem to Bethlehem is south to southwest. So we have Jupiter stopped in its retrograde motion in the night sky, south to southwest over Bethlehem from the standpoint of Jerusalem. So it matches with the story again. So let's look and see where we are in our 9 clues. So first of all, do we have anything that signifies birth? Well, we had the woman clothed with the sun. We had the coronation of Jupiter by Regulus, indicating some starting point. We had a new moon. All of those seem to indicate birth, at least a possibility of a fertility event happening. So we certainly see something that looks like it could signify birth. What about kingship? Well, we had the king's star, king's planet, king's constellation, 3 passes, and then we had these 2 conjunctions bracketing it. So it does look like maybe some kingship was involved. What about a connection with the Jewish nation? Well, again, as we pointed out, the line of Judah is the constellation Leo. The Messiah was to come from his line, and the wise men came to worship him. These magi came to worship. That's something that indicates royalty and a connection with the Jewish nation, for them to come from Babylon, or a foreign nation, to Jerusalem and worship there. So we do have something that has a connection with the Jewish nation. What about, was it ahead of the Magi from Babylon to Jerusalem? Certainly was. We kind of saw that that Jupiter was tracking toward that western horizon, and it stopped over Bethlehem and was hanging over Bethlehem at daybreak on a morning which is likely when they would have visited. So do we have a winner? We have a winner. So that seems to be the best explanation for all these things. Let me tie these things together a little bit. So these are the dates that you're going to want to think about later. August 12th of 3 BC, August 10th is the solar eclipse, the 12th is the first conjunction, September 11th would have been the coronation, would have been the woman clothed with the sun, and Jupiter about to pass Regulus for the first time. June 17th of 2 BC would be the likely evening of the birth, and December 25th of 2 BC would have been the time when the Magi visited and presented their gifts. Now again, there are other interpretations, but this seems to be a pretty cohesive way to look at it from the standpoint of the astronomy. So the question is, how rare are these? I've told you some of these things are not that rare, but when you put them all together, how rare are they? So here's your eye chart. Everybody ready? Okay. This is 1,500 years. I've done the research. I've gone through every occurrence where there was a where there was a triple conjunction of Jupiter by Regulus. This is every one of them in which there was at least one conjunction of Venus and Jupiter. So you can see that there are a fair number of these, but there are only 2 times when there is a symmetric occurrence of these, of Jupiter and Venus on either side. This one is actually, it's hard to read, I know from where you are, but it's 5 degrees 20 minutes on one side and 6:42 on the other. And this one is almost perfectly 6 degrees either side. The interesting thing about this one is that it is in a period of time when Daniel could have seen it. So he would have been about 85 to 90 years old. We don't know his exact birth date, but based on him being a late adolescent, early teen, when he was taken to Babylon in captivity, he would have been between 85 and 90 years old during that first symmetric conjunction. What if he was to tell somebody that this is the sign that's going to be preceding the Messiah, and the only other time in 1,500 years that it occurs is right there in 2 BC? So it's extremely rare. I would say it's a unique event within the time period that we're looking for the birth of Christ. So it's pretty, I find it compelling. You may disagree. We'll see. So that's it. That's the Star of Bethlehem, but there's more to the story. Why do we remember somebody's birth? We have Abraham Lincoln's birthday. Why? Because he was a special baby? No, it's because of what he did during his lifetime, right? So we remember Abraham Lincoln, we celebrate his birth, but his birth wasn't that special. Jesus' birth was pretty special. Born of a virgin, all those kind of things, astronomical stuff, kings. But his death and his life are even more important. So what if I can give you a surprise ending, and we'll see if there's an astronomical date of the crucifixion. Would that be interesting to you? Okay, well, we'll keep going then. So what we're looking for, the crucifixion is much easier to find. It's a much shorter story to tell. So we're almost there. So we're looking for a Passover, which is a calendar date. We're looking for a day of preparation, which is typically understood to be a Friday. There's some disagreement on that. A day before the Sabbath is the preparation day. And we're looking for around 30 years after the start of Jesus' ministry, sometime close to 33 years after 2 BC. It's during the reign of Pilate in 26 to 46 AD. So the window's right there. So let's look at an interesting prophecy that was in Joel, the Old Testament now. Afterward, I'll pour out my Spirit on your people. He says this about visions and dreams. He'll pour out the Spirit, show signs and wonders in the heavens, and on the earth, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. How many of you heard of this blood red moon idea? Have you heard of that before? What does it mean? It's a lunar eclipse. We typically talk about, in fact, you mentioned that earlier, a blood red moon. So if we're looking for references in literature, just in common parlance, to a blood red moon, it's a lunar eclipse. There are frequent references to this in literature. Here's why this happens. When you have the sun and the earth and the moon all lined up, with the moon on the far side from the sun, with the earth in between, we have the sun's light reflecting or being sent in all directions, but as it passes the earth's atmosphere, the red light rays, which are longer waves, are more influenced by the earth's atmosphere, and they're bent more than the blue rays. And so the moon in shadow has this reddish cast, and most of you have seen that before. It's a beautiful image. It's very dramatic, but it's a reddish moon. That's a lunar eclipse. So we had this passage in Joel. Here's a passage you probably haven't thought about as you've read through Acts. Peter stands up with the 11. He raises his voice and addresses the crowd, and he tells them all this stuff. Fellow Jews, listen to me. These guys aren't drunk. No, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. Ah, interesting. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my Spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will see dreams. We saw that before, right? And he continues to quote this exact passage. And he says, I will show you wonders in the heaven above and signs on the earth below, blood and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And then he says something that's really important, and we typically gloss over it. He says, men of Israel, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. Which means that everything he just said, including the blood red moon and the signs in the heavens, they already knew. So it doesn't record anywhere in the New Testament that the moon turned to blood except for here. And it says God did all these things and you guys know it. So he was basically calling on them to challenge him. And so that means to me that there was a lunar eclipse that was associated with this. So if we look at this continuing, so let's look at the timing of the crucifixion in terms of time of day. That's going to be important. So in Matthew, we see this period of darkness was from the 6th to the 9th hour. Now these hours are typically from sunrise. So the 6th hour is about noon, the 9th hour is about 3 p.m. If we look at Mark, this is a bit of an outline. There is some controversy on exactly what this means, but Mark first says it was the 3rd hour when they crucified him. This may be the start of the crucifixion process because according to the other Gospels, that would be about the time when they started the beatings that preceded the condemnation and the actual crucifixion. But Mark goes on, and he said, in the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, this passage I won't pronounce, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" And then he continues on and say, right after that, some standing near heard him say this, and Jesus breathed his last. So he breathes his last about the 9th hour, again, 3 p.m. That's consistent. Luke says about the 6th hour, darkness came over the land till the 9th hour. John doesn't record the date or the exact time of the death of Christ, but it says about the 6th hour is when Pilate delivered him over to actually be crucified. And so we have this consistent period from the 6th to the 9th hour when the earth experienced darkness in that region and Jesus breathes his last about the 9th hour. So we're looking for something specific around the 9th hour. So let's see if we can find an eclipse about the 9th hour. Well, first of all, the 9th hour, it's still daylight. So we're not going to see an eclipse right away. So this is the western horizon at sunset that night. So we're now looking to the western horizon. The sun is setting. In the eastern horizon, we're going to see something very unique. And so we're at 6:45 p.m. We'll see that the sunset is 6:57, so just before 7 p.m. And, let me go back. So not only is the sun setting at 6:57 p.m., the moon is rising at the same exact time. So we have the sun setting on one horizon, the moon about to rise on the other horizon, because we have this lineup of the eclipse. And so let's look at that. So as we swivel around to the eastern horizon, this is what happens. Notice it's 7 p.m., we're animating the time. And this is going to be a little difficult to see with the screen the way it is. But what we see is the moon already in the shadow of the earth. And as I animate this, you can see the shadow beginning to move across. So it rises with the moon in eclipse. It rises red and then clears up over a period of time. We're now at 8:24, so it's been up for about an hour and a half. So it starts out blood red. They've laid Jesus in the tomb. He's been crucified. The moon rises red and then clears to white. So we're going to go below the horizon now. We're at 1 p.m. in the afternoon, and we're going to just look at the moon. This would not have been visible, but it's happening at the same time. So let's watch the point at which the moon goes into the Earth's shadow. So we're at 1 p.m., and we're going to animate, and I'll call out the time for you. You just watch the moon and see when the shadow starts. So we're at 1 p.m., 2 p.m., 3 p.m., the 9th hour, and look at what's happening to the moon. It's going into the Earth's shadow at the very time that Jesus is breathing his last. And when it rises, it's, again, this animation is difficult to see, but it's a reddish moon. One of the things that Starry Night does really well is show you where the shadows are, but it doesn't capture the reddish cast very well. So what I want to show you next is, just think about this scene. Assume that you are someone who knew Jesus, who was around his ministry, was hoping that he was the Messiah. You see him beaten, you see him crucified, you see him buried. The sun sets, the moon rises red. This is what the blood red moon might have looked like. These are actual photos, not real high resolution, but it gives you the idea. But think about seeing this moon rise as it was in eclipse. And as we look at where it would have been on the horizon, it would have looked something like that as it rose. Now, if we look at where it is in astronomy, it's at the bottom of the constellation Virgo. So it has returned to the foot of the Virgin. So it started out as a new moon, signifying birth, at the birth of Christ. Now it's a full moon, a life fully lived, but bathed in blood for my sins and for yours. And it's returned to the starting point at the foot of the Virgin. As we think about this, and we look at where that is to the west, and we look at the traditional site of the crucifixion of Christ, traditionally Golgotha is in this location outside the city walls, and looking to the east, we see the temple. And so as they look to the east, to the rising moon from the site of the crucifixion and burial of Christ, the moon would have been over the temple. So symbolically, the moon is rising over the sacrifice, the place where sacrifices are made at the altar of the temple. You can't make this stuff up. There's too many coincidences. There's another perspective I have to show you simply because it's so cool. So if you were on the moon, which nobody was, but the moon, the surface of the moon is going to turn red. As the Earth comes between the sun and the moon, so that's the eclipse as viewed, it's a solar eclipse from the moon's perspective, and the foreground is, again, hard to see, but it's reddish. And as I turn on what's happening in the background, here's what we see. It's in the constellation Aries, and that's the Lamb. It's also known as the Ram of Victory and the Lamb of Sacrifice. Symbolically, what we have is the beating heart of the ram is snuffed out by the crucifixion. Again, you can't make up this kind of symbolism. Well, one of the first times I gave this presentation, I was teaching junior high earth science, and one of my students came up to me and said, "This is really cool, but what about the resurrection? Shouldn't there be something there?" I said, "I don't know, let's look." And because we had this astronomy software, you can look. And so we turned on the software, and we ran the software forward from the crucifixion moon to where's the moon on the morning of Easter. So 2 days later, we were on April 3rd, we're on April 5th at sunrise, and the moon has now left the constellation Virgo and has gone to the next constellation over, which is Libra, the balanced scales of justice, fully satisfied in the payment of Christ. So again, we see all this symbolism. Now, one of the criticisms of this view that I've described is that the constellations may not have had the same meaning to the Jews, and may not. There was an idea in the late 1800s that the gospel story was told in the stars, and there were several books that came out. There have been some criticism of that. Whether that's true or not, we still have this incredible set of conjunctions and triple pass, and we still have the crucifixion with the blood red moon rising, and the blood being removed in a white moon. So even though there is some criticism of this, even if you take away all the symbolism of the constellations, the story is still pretty coherent. So what does this mean? So let me do 30 seconds on theology and we'll close. So when we think about this, when God set this all in motion, when he set up the planets and the stars and the constellations, the solar system, here's what happened. He was setting things in motion that began a timer to a specific point in history. And that point in history came to a culmination when all of these events that I just showed you, the stars and the planets lining up in such a way that they told a specific story, at least to the Magi and maybe to us. And it meant that God knew the exact moment of Jesus' birth and death from the instant that he set everything in motion. So when Jesus was born, he was already marching toward a known point where he would be crucified, buried, and resurrected. So when God set it all in motion, he knew that all that was going to happen. And maybe if all that's there, maybe the Bible's actually true. Maybe it's recording things that are not just mythological, maybe it's actually history. And if that's true, then what do we do with this information? Well, here's where the theology comes in. In the Jewish world, there were three different kinds of law. There was religious law, which is the sacrifices and the rituals and so on. There was the moral law, which is God's ethical standards, and there was the civil law. Now, the civil law was how you ratify contracts. You pass a sandal to somebody and ratify a contract. That was valid for Israel. It's not applicable for us. So we don't abide by that. The moral law, though, that's a different issue. That's God's ethical standard, and it's valid today, and I have violated that law. And there's nothing I can do to pay for that on my own. I have to rely on God to pay for that for me. So that law is valid, and I have a problem. Then there's the religious law. The religious law is the system of sacrifices and rituals and so on. That law is fulfilled in Christ. And so in Christ, we have the fulfillment of that, and we have an opportunity to respond in faith and place faith in the one who did all of that for us. If that's something you'd like to talk about, I'd love to have a conversation with you later, or Parker would, or several of us, but it's really important to do that. So I'm going to move now to the last slide, which is to give you some references. The gentleman who came up with most of this research, there are a few things I've added that he doesn't have, but it's on your handout as well. But BethlehemStar.com is a place where he's put a lot of research in. I don't know if I didn't check to see if the DVD is still available, but he had a DVD that came out a number of years ago. It's very well done. Tells most of the things. I've added a few details that he either didn't squeeze in or whatever, but I found them interesting. All the music is from his wife, Julie Larson, who's a very gifted musician, so I appreciate Rick and Julie allowing me to use their materials, and I've got my email here, and it's on your paper, so if you have questions, I'd love to entertain those. Let me pray for us, and if there's questions, we'll do those. So Lord, we thank you that you've given us some signs we can look at, and that we can be confident, regardless of how much of this is exactly the way it happened. We know that the story of the cross and the crucifixion and the resurrection is true. And we trust you for that, we love you for that, and we honor you tonight in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so what questions do you have? Yes?
So this picture of the star that we see nowadays.
Oh, hang on. Parker, do you have the microphone, or is that? Yeah. It'll be easier for people to hear if we give you a microphone. So we're not trying to put you on the spot.
Great, thanks. So the depictions we see of the star with the design, the diamonds and everything, with the convergence of Jupiter and everything, would it be more just like a round light, a round glow they were seeing?
Which time period do you mean?
Well, when they were following the star of Bethlehem.
So Jupiter is interesting because it's so bright that it's visible during the day. So when they were on their journey, they would have been following it during daylight. And you can actually see Jupiter in the daylight. It's one of the only things you can see in the daylight sky, even with our city light pollution or with dust in the air. You can see Jupiter in the daytime if you know where to look. And they would have been looking for that. So it would have been a point of light. And you can go look for it. Tonight it's going to be rising about 10 p.m. So by tomorrow morning it should still, I think, be in the western sky. I've looked to see, so it should be setting around 10 a.m. probably. So in the morning tomorrow, if you can get low on the horizon toward the western sky, you should be able to see Jupiter. And that's what they would have been looking at that point. I will be here as long as you have questions. Thank you very much for your attention. Praise to God.